Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof, and welcome to this week's edition of the Dissenter Weekly for September 16th, 2001. And before we get to our stories for this week, hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly for this week, the week of September 16th, 2001. Before we get to our stories that I have lined up for you, I want to remind everyone, if this is your first time viewing, and if you haven't already, to hit the subscribe button on the Shadowproof channel, get alerts for when we go live and do this broadcast. It's a regular show. We do the Dissenter Weekly every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And you'll also get alerts when we post any other videos that we may do at our channel. So here's this week. We'll start with the FinCEN files whistleblower who reported to federal prison. This is Natalie Mayflower Sowers Edwards, the FinCEN files whistleblower. You may not be familiar with her. We haven't covered her as much on the show, but she reported to federal prison camp Alderson in West Virginia on September 3rd. It's a minimum security prison, and musician Billie Holiday and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the co-founder of the ACLU, who the ACLU ousted because she was a communist, they were both once incarcerated at the facility. And Edwards was part of the United States Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. That's what FinCEN stands for. She was convicted of, quote, unlawfully disclosing suspicious activity reports, known as SARS, and other sensitive information. Her prison sentence is not the result of an Espionage Act prosecution. That's not what she was charged under, but the criminalization of her whistleblowing to shed light on the role of banks in money laundering was treated like an act of espionage. In other words, they went by much of the same playbook. Her husband, Dave, recently spoke with Whistleblower Network News, a good internet publication for you to bookmark if you haven't already, and shared details about the, quote, world of lockdown, end quote, that Edwards entered. She has no access to the internet. She is allowed very little phone usage. She has little to no access to media covering current events. So she's cut off from the outside world. And the first case of COVID-19 while she was at the prison occurred on the anniversary of 9/11, providing occasion for Dave to comment, quote, I find it truly remarkable that on 9/11/21, 20 years after the most horrible terrorist event to happen to our country, my wife sits in a quarantine prison, remembering that 20 years ago, the slogan was, if you see something, say something. My fiance then, Natalie, was teaching high school physics and told me that her career goals had changed after that event. She wanted to serve her country by working for the federal government. She chose higher educational degrees crafted toward federal employment and her goal of protection of the American people. Once in government, she had different assignments that always were aimed at guarding the United States. As an ethical and honest person, Natalie saw something and decided she had a responsibility to reveal about and say something about government corruption. Natalie was thrown in prison because she made the decision to report corruption. So apparently the see something, say something slogan only applies to a few government employees, excluding those working intelligence. The fact the government had to twist the truth and slander the character of my wife, a whistleblower, is pure evil. So she's there now. She has some medical conditions. She's concerned about having access to medical care. This is a feature of Espionage Act prosecutions. Again, though, not prosecuted under the Espionage Act. But this is what happens to whistleblowers who are imprisoned in the United States. And we saw problems with access to health care when looking at the case against Jeffrey Sterling. There were issues that John Kiriakou, CIA whistleblower, had to deal with when he was incarcerated. So this is a facet of these cases. It's something that we'll keep a close eye on. And it's 6 months. She probably won't be in prison for that entire amount of time. But nonetheless, she's there at a very precarious time where she could be exposed to a virus, or if she's not given access to the medications she needs, she could come down with health complications as a result of her incarceration. Let's continue on to the next story, which is about a Google whistleblower who alleges the tech corporation illegally underpaid temp workers. This was reported for The Guardian by journalist Julia Carey Wong, reporting on this happening in dozens of countries. The big tech corporation attempted to cover up the problem while delaying a correction in pay rates that violated the law for more than 2 years. Documents and emails from Google were reviewed by The Guardian, and they indicate Google executives knew as early as May 2019 that they were not complying with laws in the United Kingdom, Europe, and Asia, which require temporary workers be paid an equal rate to full-time employees. A whistleblower filed a complaint with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission and alleges Google failed to, quote, disclose the pay party liabilities, which it estimates could amount to $100 million. Those misstatements in their quarterly financial reports allegedly violated U.S. securities law, according to this whistleblower. John Tai, the founder and chief disclosure officer of Whistleblower Aid, told The Guardian the disclosure makes it clear that Google hasn't just broken labor laws around the world, but has misled investors about major legal and financial liabilities. The lawful anonymous whistleblower disclosure is a critical step toward ensuring that Google is held to account. And Wong points out that the use of contingent workers is common in the tech industry, but Google's reliance on a shadow workforce, in quotes, shadow workforce, that outnumbers its direct employee base has long drawn criticism from the company's own employees, as well as politicians and labor unions. And there are no protections for temporary workers at Google in the United States. So if you were following this story and wondering where the US comes into play, actually, there's not much that a whistleblower can do as far as challenge this in the United States. That's why they have to go through a different roundabout way of challenging it, actually taking an action on behalf of shareholders of Google rather than more directly trying to stand up for the interests of workers. And so that says a lot about this country. Going on to our next story that we have for you. It's about migrant children. We return to the unfolding horrors that we continue to learn about at Fort Bliss. And there have been multiple whistleblowers that have come forward to describe what is happening. This latest whistleblower came forward and was a volunteer at the facility from April to May of 2021. They claim personnel, quote, regularly threaten children with deportation. Lights are left on 24 hours a day in tents, and that children have burnt and blistered their skin from something called skin lightening lotion that is being given to them instead of safe moisturizing lotion. We've had prior claims about COVID-19 outbreaks at the facility, gross mismanagement by the contractors put in charge. And there have also been allegations of sexual assault against children that were reported by outlets like the BBC. BBC even quoted one worker who said, "We have already caught staff with minors inappropriately." And assume they meant that they were engaged in inappropriate conduct with those children. So we'll keep following this as it develops. It's been making headlines for the last 3 or 4 months, and certainly an important group of whistleblowers to keep following. The story here that we have next is on an EPA whistleblower who is standing up against retaliation that they have faced Her name is Ruth Etzel, an EPA whistleblower allegedly targeted for retaliation. She had a hearing before an administrative body known as the Merit Systems Protection Board this last week. They review these complaints, usually labor related, not often about the substance of the whistleblower claim. And in this case, Etzel's a pediatrician and epidemiologist who went to work for the EPA in 2015. The Guardian details her history, background, and why she's blowing the whistle. She's a global expert on children's health issues. She fought to reduce childhood exposure to lead from air, water, soil, paint, and food, which stalled when President Donald Trump was elected and he appointed corporate lobbyists like Scott Pruitt and Andrew Wheeler to run the agency. In 2018, Etzel filed a complaint against the EPA over delays and the mistreatment she was going through at the agency. So from the Guardian's reporting, quote, outside influence pushes agency scientists to make important assessments in ways that will protect their jobs rather than protect the public. And the whistleblowers have alleged a range of wrongdoing by the EPA, including using intimidation tactics against the agency's own scientists to protect the interests of certain industries, even when doing so puts the public at risk. The problems have continued into the Biden administration, according to Etzel's allegations. Etzel was put on leave. She was demoted. She had her pay cut. There were complaints that were made against her, fabricated in order to humiliate, and she was blocked from speaking at professional conferences. On September 2018, so September 28th, in 2018, a top EPA public affairs official wrote to the press secretary of the EPA and other public affairs officers, quote, this is our opportunity to strike. The email thread with the subject line, push this around ASAP, please, came from public affairs officials who agreed to a statement about Etzel that was much stronger, more harsh, and said that serious reports were made against her by staff, and they were very concerning. So they encouraged this campaign of humiliation because, well, let's go back, she wanted to protect children from lead poisoning. And so in the EPA's capture, they're captured by a lot of these companies rather than regulate them, which is what they're supposed to do. Then they are destroying the scientist. So that's where we get this quote from Etzel. The old playbook was attack the scientist, attack the science. And now the new playbook is destroy the science. So that has continued under Biden. They are defending the way that they handled Etzel before this Merit Systems Protection Board. The EPA doesn't believe anything went wrong. They believe that Etzel's the problem. And so we'll see how she does in prevailing against the EPA and the wider Bush administration when it comes to her claim of being retaliated as a whistleblower. So the next thing that I have is actually a story that has been getting a fair amount of play because of the fact that Bob Woodward has another book coming out. It has some details or what he thinks is bombshell information about the Trump administration. And we've seen something making ripples related to General Mark Milley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the book coming from Bob Woodward claims that he held calls with Chinese military leaders to head off a nuclear confrontation. And a whistleblower who was revered under the Trump administration and by liberals and Democrats actually taking a different tack on this, not hewing to what you would expect based upon what you might hear on MSNBC, going a different direction, a more principled route. Alexander Vindman, the whistleblower who's the Ukraine call whistleblower, went on CNN and also sent a tweet condemning Milley if this is true. Again, saying we need some further verification, but presuming that Bob Woodward has gotten this right and what is being reflected is actually what happened, this is something that is hugely troubling. So let's watch the clip. He was on Chris Cuomo, and he talked with them about this and his views about why Milley needs to resign. He said that Milley is tainted and needs to quit. All right, so that's the clip of Mark Milley. And Mark Milley, of course, has become beloved by the liberal establishment, talking about things like critical race theory. And now you've got this. So this idea that he was some kind of a bulwark against Donald Trump, I think you'll see that most of the liberal establishment media are likely to justify and believe that this is okay, that a general would take it upon himself to try and check the power of a president without going to Congress, where he really should have turned to if he really believes that the threat was as severe as it was. So that's really important. Another thing I want to say before I wrap up this week's show is there's a story that broke involving 3 former intelligence operatives, 3 ex-U.S. intelligence officers who admitted to hacking for the United Arab Emirates. And this is, I don't know if this is, you can call this fallout from the reporting on Pegasus spyware, which we covered earlier this year, but it may or may not be related to it. But certainly from the writing, the UAE was one of the countries that was accused of using malware from this Israeli company, the NSO Group. And now we find out that there are these 3 former intelligence officers, U.S. citizens Mark Bayer, Ryan Adams, and a former U.S. citizen named Daniel Gorecki, who worked for a company that did cyber services for the UAE government. And they were actually involved in being senior managers, carrying out hacking operations for the benefit of the UAE government. And these would have been against activists, journalists, and potentially even rival countries. Just recall what we learned from Pegasus and how there were different targets who were totally innocent that were targeted by this spyware. And they supervised the creation of 2 similar sophisticated zero-click computer hacking and intelligence gathering systems called Karma and Karma 2. I'm reading from a BBC News report. And these could compromise a device without any action by the target and allowed users to access tens of millions of devices made by a U.S. technology company that was not identified, probably Apple. And so the Justice Department says that they illegally obtained and used credentials for online accounts issued by U.S. companies. They obtained unauthorized access to computers and mobile phones around the world, including the U.S. This is a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act offense that they're talking about. People have done serious time in prison, like Jeremy Hammond, for being accused of this kind of conduct. People connected to WikiLeaks disclosures. Chelsea Manning was found guilty of computer fraud and abuse offenses. So the hackers for hire, and although she didn't do any hacking, that was actually an abuse of the law. So they go on to say that hackers for hire and those who otherwise support such activities in violation of U.S. law should fully expect to be prosecuted for their criminal conduct. So we got this, puffery. And then the Justice Department says it filed the charges against the 3 men under a deferred prosecution agreement. What's a deferred prosecution agreement? It's a contract that they established, and in this case, financial penalties will be owed. I believe the sum is up here. It's more than $1 million altogether for the three men. They now have to sever their ties with UAE intelligence or any law enforcement agencies in UAE, and they'll never be able to seek a U.S. security clearance again. But they're going to serve no prison time. They're not going to prison. And doesn't even say that they're being given probation. I don't know if they are or not. It's possible they have some kind of supervised release. But they enter this contract, and it's basically to say that if they engage in this good behavior and do what they expect, what the U.S. Justice Department expects, then it's fine. So essentially, you can be a hacker for hire for a Gulf monarchy and help them target activists or journalists, and you can do less prison time than a whistleblower who is convicted under the Espionage Act and criminalized for talking to a reporter or releasing documents without authorization from a superior government official. That is apparently a worse offense. And of course it is. We live in a security state. So we got to let off the intelligence people who are using their skills that undoubtedly, I'm sure they learned while they were working for the U.S. government. And then they tried to apply them in a corporate setting, or it just turns out that they did so in a way that's illegal. And so, but it's not like there wouldn't ever be a legal setting for it. I mean, this is stuff that the NSA is likely doing in some capacity, and other intelligence agencies have employed in some capacity. So you won't go to prison for it. And so imagine if someone accused of leaking could sign a contract and just say that they promise to never disclose information ever again to, let's say, The Intercept or The Guardian or The Washington Post, New York Times, whatever it might be. Just make that pledge, sign a contract with the Justice Department. They'll never get a security clearance again. Of course they won't, because at that point, the agencies know that they're a leaker or a whistleblower. They can't trust them with the classified information. Trust in quotes, trust being their own idea of trust. I would think it's trustworthy of people to show us information that's in the public interest. They don't leak everything. These people who have access to entire databases don't leak every single bit of information that they can access, just the ones, the databases and the collections of documents that are in the public interest. But in any case, or they talk to a reporter about things that are in the public interest. Imagine if they could enter a contract with the Justice Department. I think there's a lot of whistleblowers in the past 10 or 15 years that would take that deal. It's a pretty sweet deal. So these men are lucky. These men are fortunate to live in the United States, a place where this isn't as serious as telling the truth about national security offenses or offenses committed under the guise of protecting national security is how I should say it. Well, thank you for tuning in to this broadcast of the Dissenter Weekly. I have one plug as we wrap up the show. There is the newsletter URL. If you go to thedissenter.org, you can become a subscriber of the Dissenter newsletter. We publish stories on whistleblowers regularly, and currently we're doing a retrospective series on 9/11, linking it back to whistleblowers who came forward over the past 20 years at great risk, challenging the rise of the national security state. And there's also a parallel series that I'm doing on film. 9/11 Cinema is the name of the series, looking at its impact on culture. Both films that criticized the trend, went up against the grain, as well as films that reflected that the rah-rah jingoism of the time, possibly, or benefited from the closing down of our freedom of expression as a result of the war on terrorism. So I encourage you to go to thedissenter.org, read those, share those. If you support this work, consider becoming a subscriber. And if you like what we're doing and want to see this work be expanded, become a paid subscriber of The Dissenter. It's a project of Shadowproof. It's not published at shadowproof.com, but this is a project, a newsletter supported by people who are members and who fund Shadowproof in addition to the people who are subscribers of the newsletter itself. That may be a bit confusing, but there's a lot going on with us. We still have the Marvel Cook Fellowship. There are going to be more freelance journalism pieces coming. Brian Nam Sonnenstein, my partner, could not join us today, but he's still doing the Beyond Prisons podcast, which I highly recommend. And we talked about incarceration with Natalie Mayflower Sowers Edwards at the top of this show. And he certainly has a lot to say with scholars and people breaking down incarceration and also looking at it from an abolition perspective. So if that's something of interest, go to the Beyond Prisons podcast. That about does it for what I have to plug. Thank you all for tuning in to the show. And I'll be back with Brian, hopefully, as my partner to help me get through the different stories. I'll be back next week with another edition of Dissenter Weekly.